Now, let's get into one of the most important aspects of doing well on IELTS Speaking Part 2, and that involves note taking. The note taking process is very, very straightforward. In terms of your opening, I'm going to talk about this probably in the next slide. But when you're taking notes, do not write down your opening statement. Do not write down the first two sentences of what you're going to say. That is the biggest mistake that I see so many students do. Don't do that. You need to focus on getting the information that you're going to talk about in your discussion points. Because if you have good notes, when you're speaking, you can focus on how you're going to say something and not have to think about first what you're going to say, then how you're going to say it. So, for point number one, you're going to, let's go back for a second, sorry. For point one, you're going to write down 2 or 3 discussion points. Okay. And then for point number 2, you're going to have 2 or 3 discussion points. For point number 3, you have 2 or 3 discussion points. And you have a conclusion. Right? Now, if you have 4 discussion points, then that's fine. You'll have point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, and you'll have a conclusion. Like I said, sometimes you can have 3 discussion points or you can have 4 discussion points. All right, so looks like my computer has been trying to jump to this screen. I guess maybe it knows that this is something really important that I want to say to you, which is don't make this big mistake in your note taking. Don't write out your opening, right? So, for example, some students when they take notes, they'll write out their opening statement, right? Although I've had many phones over the years, I'll always remember the first cellular phone I ever owned. Today I'm going to talk about my Nokia 550, the first phone I owned. Right? Some students spend their 1 minute of note-taking time and they'll write out their opening statement. That is the biggest mistake that causes bad scores on part number 2. Number 1, all you're doing is copying the question language. You're copying down the question language. When you're just here, you can see here, it says describe your first mobile phone you ever owned, right? And in this statement over here, you can literally see that the person is copying the question language, which shows zero talent in English. This is what most basic level students do on the exam. Don't do that. Also, when you write out an opening statement, it prevents you from taking notes on the discussion prompts. That's what you need to do. You have to be able to take those notes on the 3 or 4 discussion points. That way you know what you're going to talk about. So now we're going to look at some examples of taking notes. This first question is a question that's dealing with an object. A question is dealing with an object. Right? So it says, describe your first mobile phone you ever owned. Please say, how old were you when you got it? When and why did you buy it? How did you feel when you first got it? So over here, we can see that we have the opening statement, and I did not write anything. We only have 1 minute to take these notes. 1 minute, that's all. So within that time period, I'm going to write down some notes for discussion point number 1. There are my 3 things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to write down my discussion point number 2. Here are the items I'm going to talk about in terms of when and why did I buy it. And here are my points or my ideas for discussion point number 3. How did I feel? Excited, jumping around. I ran around and showed everybody. Over here, you can see that I'm saying for point number 1, you need to take 20 seconds to write down what you're going to talk about. 20 seconds for point number 3, 20 seconds for point number 4. Now, of course, if there are 4 points or 4 discussion points, that's going to be 15 seconds for each discussion point. Now, on the exam itself, this is what your notes would look like. because you're going to be given paper to take notes on. So you would write down what you're going to talk about for discussion point 1, what you're going to write down for discussion point 2, and what would you write down, what you're going to talk about for discussion point 3. If you have this information in front of you, it makes it very, very easy to be able to speak because you know what's coming next. All right, let's get into another example of organizing and taking notes. Taking notes really is the most helpful skill that I can try to explain to you for part number 2. Most of my students that score really, really well, and I'm talking about the